The wind howled through the cracks of a lonely cabin deep in the Wyoming wilderness, rattling the shutters like restless spirits. Eli Mercer sat bolt upright in his cot, his hand already reaching for the rifle propped against the wall. There it was again, a faint knock. Soft, hesitant, almost frightened. He swung his legs off the cot, the floorboards cold beneath his bare feet, and padded to the door. When he opened it, a small boy stood barefoot in the snow, shivering violently. His lips were cracked and blue, his breath nothing but ragged gasps of steam in the freezing night. Before Eli could ask a single question, the boy swayed once, then collapsed into his arms like a sack of feathers. Eli caught him, staring into the darkness beyond his porch, into the endless, moonlit wilderness. He didn't know who the boy was. He didn't know what danger might be following. But one thing Eli knew for certain: trouble had just crossed his threshold. Eli Mercer laid the boy near the fire, wrapped in a blanket, and sat back on his heels, staring at him. The kid couldn't have been more than 8, maybe 9. Skin pale under a layer of frostbite, ribs showing beneath a ragged cloak, fingers scraped raw. Eli fed the flames, watching sparks swirl up the chimney and vanish into the cold night. His mind wandered back to a place he tried so damn hard to forget. Platte Creek. He shut his eyes, but it came anyway, like it always did. The smell of black powder, the screaming, the fire, the last stand of the 3rd Union Scouts, surrounded by Sioux warriors on 3 sides and the swollen creek on the 4th. That day, Eli had been a scout, a good one, maybe one of the best. He could track a man across granite, tell weather by the smell of the wind, find water where everyone else swore there was none. But none of that mattered when the bullets started flying. He remembered his brother's face, pale under the brim of his hat, shouting for him to run. He remembered refusing, and he remembered the blood, hot and sticky, running down his hands as he tried to hold his brother's chest together, while arrows rained like thunder all around them. By nightfall, his unit was gone, every last man. And when the smoke cleared, Eli crawled out from under the bodies, staggering through the creek like a ghost who didn't belong in the world of the living anymore. He never forgave himself, didn't forgive the Sioux either. After Platte Creek, he left the army without a word, walked west until the forts disappeared and the land swallowed him whole, built himself a cabin where no one would find him, buried his old life in a shallow grave, and stopped listening for drums in the distance. He hunted when he had to, trapped beaver, traded pelts once every few months at a supply outpost 2 days' ride south. But he never stayed long enough for talk, and he sure as hell didn't make friends. Friends died, brothers died, units died. No, solitude suited him fine. He'd carved out a small, quiet existence here at the edge of nowhere. No war, no alliances, no enemies, just snow, pine, and silence. And yet, here lay this boy, this fragile, freezing child, dropped like a stone from some unseen storm, stirring up ghosts Eli had spent years trying to drown. Eli leaned forward, feeding the boy a few drops of water, careful not to choke him. The kid stirred, lips moving faintly, whispering something in a tongue Eli barely understood. Sounded like Sioux. His stomach nodded. For a long while, Eli just sat there in the glow of the fire, staring at the carved talisman dangling from the boy's neck. A small falcon cut from bone, strung on leather and beads. Couldn't be, but it was. He'd seen that symbol before. Years ago, before Platte Creek. It belonged to Iron Hawk. Even out here, Eli had heard the stories. Iron Hawk wasn't just a war chief, he was legend. Cunning, relentless. A man who never forgave a slight and never left a debt unpaid. And this child was wearing his mark. Eli swore under his breath and sat back hard against the wall, the old boards groaning under his weight. He didn't know why the boy was here. He didn't know who had left him to freeze in the Wyoming wilderness, half dead and barefoot. But he knew one thing beyond any doubt. If this really was Iron Hawk's son, the Sioux would be coming. And when they came, there wouldn't be any talking. Eli stared at the fire, jaw tight, every muscle in his body coiled. He'd left that war behind. He wanted no part of it. And yet, The boy shivered in his blankets, fragile as a dying ember. Outside, the wind screamed across the frozen ridges, rattling the cabin like an omen. Inside, Eli sat unmoving, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the child. He'd chosen solitude to keep trouble away. But trouble had found him anyway. And deep down, Eli knew the truth. There's no outrunning the past. The boy slept for hours, breathing shallow and uneven, the heat from the fire slowly chasing the frost from his skin. Eli kept busy, though his mind churned like a river in spring flood. He boiled water, mashed dried venison into a thin broth, and stitched the boy's torn cloak as best he could. Every so often, the kid twitched in his sleep, murmuring in his native tongue, and Eli caught fragments of words he didn't understand. But one thing was clear. This wasn't some lost settler's child. Late in the afternoon, the boy woke with a soft groan. His eyelids fluttered, and his dark, glassy eyes fixed on Eli with confusion and fear. "You're safe," Eli said gently, crouching beside him. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you here." The boy flinched at his voice, curling in on himself like a cornered animal. His ribs showed sharp beneath the skin, each breath ragged and shallow. Eli reached for the wooden bowl and held it out. "Drink." For a moment the kid just stared. Then, trembling, he took the bowl with both hands and sipped. Most of it spilled down his chin, but he got enough to swallow. "What's your name, son?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Chayton." His voice cracked, raw from cold and hunger. Eli nodded slowly. "All right, Chayton. You're safe now." Safe. He almost laughed at the word. As Chayton ate, Eli studied him closely. The scars on his ankles, the bruises along his arms, the half-healed cut above his eye. This boy had been through hell before he ever stumbled to Eli's door. And then there was the necklace. That damn necklace. When Eli finally had a moment alone, he turned the carved falcon over in his hand, the smooth bone catching firelight. It wasn't just decoration. It was a mark of blood. Years ago, during a truce meeting along the Powder River, Eli had seen Iron Hawk himself wearing one just like it. Every warrior in his inner circle bore the falcon. It was more than a symbol. It was a promise. Whoever touched a man bearing it without permission signed their own death sentence. Eli cursed under his breath and shoved the talisman back under the boy's cloak. "Hell, kid," he muttered. "What mess did you drag me into?" That night, sleep didn't come easy. Eli sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, listening to the wind rattle the pines and whip snow against the cabin walls. Every distant creak of ice, every snap of branches made him reach for his weapon. He couldn't stop thinking about Platte Creek, about the sound of war drums rolling across the hills just before dawn, the war cries slicing the air, the endless tide of painted warriors on horseback. If Iron Hawk's son was here, then Iron Hawk would come for him. That wasn't a possibility, it was a fact. And if Iron Hawk found a Union scout sheltering his son, Eli didn't want to think about what came next. The next morning, Eli woke to the sound of soft coughing. Chayton was sitting up by the fire, pale and weak but awake. He clutched the blanket tight around his shoulders, eyes darting nervously to the windows. "Hungry?" Eli asked, kneeling to stir the pot of venison broth. Chayton hesitated, then nodded once. As Eli handed him the bowl, he caught a glimpse of something else, faint lines of dried blood beneath the boy's fingernails. Not the boy's own blood, someone else's. "You're gonna have to tell me what happened," Eli said quietly. Chayton stiffened, hugging the blanket tighter, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Bad men," he whispered finally. "They take me, kill my uncle. I run." Eli's jaw clenched. That explained the bruises, the half-frozen feet, the terror in the boy's eyes. But it didn't explain why Iron Hawk's son was wandering the wilderness alone. "Who are these men?" Eli asked, keeping his tone calm. Chayton didn't answer. As the day stretched on, Eli tried again and again to piece together the boy's story, but Chayton shut down each time. He spoke little, avoiding eye contact, curling close to the fire as though its warmth was the only thing holding him together. By nightfall, Eli had resigned himself to ignorance, and that made him uneasy. He went outside to chop wood, his breath pluming white in the bitter air, when he noticed something that froze him to the marrow. Tracks. Fresh tracks, only hours old. Horses. At least 3, maybe more. Eli crouched, brushing snow from the ground, following the trail until it vanished into the dense pines beyond the ridge. Whoever they were, they hadn't come close to the cabin yet, but they were out there, watching. He returned to the cabin and barred the door, his mind heavy with calculation. If those riders were hunting Iron Hawk's boy, they'd find this place soon enough. And if they weren't, if they were Sioux scouts instead, either way, blood was coming. Later, as the fire burned low, Chayton finally spoke again. "My father," he said softly, almost too quiet to hear. "He find me?" Eli stared at him for a long moment. "Yeah, kid," he said finally. "If he's looking, he'll find you." Chayton nodded, clutching his falcon necklace. "He kill bad men. All of them." Eli didn't doubt that for a second. But he also knew something Chayton didn't. Iron Hawk wouldn't care who got caught in the crossfire. And come hell or high water, Eli Mercer was standing right in it. Eli sat at the rough-hewn table, a cup of bitter coffee cooling between his hands. Outside, the wind carried the faint creak of pines shifting beneath their burden of snow, the distant groan of the frozen earth. Inside, the cabin was quiet save for the boys' soft breathing near the fire. Every instinct in Eli screamed one thing: walk away. He wasn't the Union scout anymore, wasn't the man who rode with detachments and followed orders. He wasn't anyone's savior. He'd buried that part of himself at Platte Creek along with his brother and his faith in people. And yet, he glanced at the boy, curled beneath a blanket, dark lashes resting against pale cheeks. Chayton's fingers clutched the falcon talisman like it was the only tether keeping him alive. Eli cursed under his breath and rubbed his hands over his face. He could ride south tonight, leave the boy here. He could make it past the foothills, past the ridges, and into the outpost before anyone knew he'd even been involved. Let Iron Hawk find his son on his own. That would be the smart play, the safe play. But when Eli imagined waking up tomorrow knowing he'd left a half-frozen child to die in the wilderness, his gut twisted like a knife. No, that wasn't who he was. He might be many things. A loner, a ghost of a soldier, a man running from the echoes of war, but he wasn't a coward. The decision settled heavy on his shoulders. He would protect the boy. Eli got to work, gathering supplies from the shelves. Dried meat, a skin of water, an old army blanket. He laid out his tools on the table. Knives honed to a whisper's edge, a handful of rifle cartridges, the battered Colt revolver he hadn't touched in months. Chayton stirred, blinking sleepily at him. "We go?" he asked in broken English. Eli shook his head. "Not yet, son. Too cold out there tonight." The boy hesitated, then pointed at the door. "Bad men," he whispered. "I know." Eli crouched beside him, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "But I got you. Understand." Chayton searched his face for a moment, then nodded, clutching the blanket tighter. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation and unease. Eli taught Chayton how to stay low when they moved, how to keep quiet when the wind carried sound. They fetched water from the creek, cut firewood, patched what cracks they could in the cabin walls. But danger wasn't a distant possibility anymore. It was here. Eli found more tracks along the western ridge, horses, many of them, fresh. He saw smoke in the distance where no settler cabin stood, too close and too deliberate to be anything but scouts. And every night, as the wind carried the sounds of the wilderness, Eli swore he heard something else beneath it. Faint, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Drums. On the third morning, Chayton finally spoke more than a handful of words. He sat by the fire, carving a small stick with Eli's old knife, his voice soft and halting. "My uncle take me north," he said, eyes fixed on the blade. "Far from camp, far from enemies." Eli frowned. "Enemies? Who's after you?" The boy hesitated. "Crow Fong." he whispered at last. Like the name itself carried weight. He hate my father. He take men, kill my uncle, chase me. I run. Eli leaned back, processing the name. Crofong, he remembered that one. A young Sioux warrior, fiery and ambitious, always pushing against Iron Hawk's leadership. If Chayton was right, this wasn't just a rescue mission. It was politics, power struggle, which meant if Crofong got his hands on the boy, Eli wouldn't just be caught in a feud, he'd be tangled in a war. That night, Eli cleaned his rifle with slow, deliberate care. Every movement was muscle memory. Each click and scrape a ritual from a life he thought he'd left behind. Chayton watched him silently, sitting cross-legged on the floor, the fire painting his face in shifting amber light. You know how to shoot? Eli asked, half teasing, half curious. Chayton shook his head, clutching the falcon necklace. Father, teach me, bow. Not this. Good, Eli muttered, sliding the cleaned barrel back into place. Let's hope we don't need it. But deep down, he knew they would. By the fourth day, the sense of being hunted was no longer subtle. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. The usual chatter of birds was absent. The scurry of rabbits under brush stilled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Eli spotted shadows moving at the edge of the tree line, far enough to vanish when he turned, close enough to confirm they were real. They're here, he murmured, loading the rifle and setting it against the window frame. Chayton pressed close to him, small fingers gripping the back of his coat. Father? He asked, hope trembling in his voice. Eli shook his head. Not yet. That evening, just as the sun began to sink behind the peaks, a figure appeared on the ridge above the cabin. Distant, silhouetted against a burning orange sky. Crofong. Even from here, Eli recognized the young warrior's braids and the streak of ochre paint across his chest. Behind him, half a dozen riders waited, motionless as carved idols. The message was clear, we know where you are. Eli stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, his heart steady as the mountain beneath his feet. You picked the wrong cabin, friend, he muttered under his breath. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if it came to him, he'd meet it standing. That night, the drums were no longer faint. They rolled across the valley like distant thunder, deep and relentless, vibrating through the frozen earth. Chayton lay curled under his blanket, eyes wide open, silent tears tracing down his cheeks. Eli sat awake by the fire, rifle across his knees, gaze fixed on the door. He knew what was coming, and he knew there was no running from it now. For the first time in years, Eli Mercer felt alive. Not because he wanted this fight, but because some things were worth fighting for. A boy's life, promise unspoken, even if it killed him. Dawn was pale and brittle, the sky a washed-out silver over the snow-blanketed valley. Eli stood at the edge of his cabin porch, the frozen wind biting through his coat. Every sense was alert, every nerve coiled like a spring. From the ridge, he could see them. Over 200 mounted warriors moving silently, deliberately, horses' hooves churning snow into a mist that hung low across the valley. Iron Hawk's war banner wasn't there yet, but Eli recognized the discipline, the unmistakable aura of vengeance in their approach. Crofong led them, young, reckless, eyes sharp as flint. He rode with a confidence Eli had seen before in men who believed in their own invincibility, the kind that ended badly. Eli's gut tightened. The boy, Chayton, was curled beneath the blankets, staring up at him with wide, fearful eyes. They'll take you, son, Eli whispered, voice low. But I'll do what I can. Chayton clutched the falcon talisman, lips pressed together, silent as a shadow. He didn't fully understand the danger yet, but he knew it was grave. Eli moved inside, closing and barricading the cabin door with every spare board he could find. The wind rattled the edges, carrying with it a distant rhythmic boom, the thud of hooves on hard-packed snow, and the faint drum of war from further down the valley. The Sioux weren't just coming. They were hunting. By mid-morning, the valley had fallen silent, almost unnaturally so. No crows in the trees, no rabbits scurrying beneath the brush. only the low thrum of distant hooves and the crunch of snow beneath mounted warriors. Eli had packed a few essentials for Chayton into a small leather pouch. Dried venison, a bit of hard bread, water from the creek, and the blanket he'd sewn back together. He laid it carefully beside the boy. "If it comes to it, take this and run," Eli murmured. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." Chayton shook his head. "I stay." "I know," Eli said softly, heart tightening. "I'd be damned if I let you face them alone." Hours dragged. The snow continued to fall in fine, icy flakes, covering tracks and footprints. Eli scanned the ridge with his rifle, eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun on snow. Every time a shadow moved between the trees, his heart leapt. He could see their strategy forming even at this distance. The warriors spread out, encircling the valley like a tightening noose. Crowfong signaled with a hand, and the front lines began to advance slowly. They weren't reckless. They weren't rushing. They were patient, predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Eli clenched his teeth. The boy's life, his own survival, all depended on his next moves. By late afternoon, Eli heard the unmistakable sound of drumming rolling across the valley. At first, it was distant, almost ceremonial. But as the hours passed, the beat grew heavier, more insistent. The Sioux were signaling. Crowfong's riders moved in tighter formation, keeping pace with the rhythm of the drums. Eli's mind raced, calculating every possible tactic. He had a few rifles, some gunpowder, and the knowledge of the land, but against over 200 warriors? The odds were impossible. He walked to the edge of the cabin and looked out at the valley below. Snow shimmered under the waning light, horses like dark shadows moving in disciplined lines, riders scanning the treeline. Every instinct screamed that he was outmatched, and yet he could feel it in his bones. There was no turning back now. Chayton stepped closer, small and pale against the cold. "Father?" he asked, voice trembling. "Will they hurt us?" Eli knelt beside him, hand brushing the boy's shoulder. "If they try, yes," he admitted. "But I'm not letting that happen." The boy nodded once, tightening his grip on the falcon necklace. There was courage in that small frame, fragile but unyielding. Eli's eyes narrowed. He had to buy time, a few more hours, maybe until Iron Hawk himself arrived. The first shots rang out just as the sun dipped behind the western ridges, painting the sky in fire orange and crimson streaks. Crowfong's warriors had encircled the cabin completely now, cutting off escape routes. A few hunters attempted to flank the cabin through the trees. Arrows knocked and bows taut. Eli fired into the approaching shadows, each shot precise, each impact buying precious seconds. Snow sprayed around the feet of the first riders, throwing them off balance, but they recovered quickly, advancing relentlessly. Chayton pressed close, small hands gripping Eli's coat, wide-eyed but silent. "Father, they come?" Eli's jaw tightened. "Yeah, but we hold. You hear me? We hold." The wind carried the rhythmic drumming closer, growing louder with every heartbeat, the valley trembling beneath the hooves of warriors. Then, over the noise, Eli heard a new sound, the deep, commanding voice of Iron Hawk. It rolled across the valley like thunder, cutting through the chaos. "Where is my son?" Eli froze for a moment, rifle raised, eyes scanning the horizon. At the front of the massed warriors, Iron Hawk emerged. His presence alone was like a mountain rising from the plains. Obsidian eyes, tall, unyielding. The other riders shifted slightly, making way for their chief. Crowfong hesitated, teeth bared in a snarl, but he did not act. Iron Hawk's gaze swept the cabin, then fell on Eli, calm but unreadable. "You," the chief said, voice low but carrying the weight of authority, "brought my son to life. For that, you are under my protection." But then his gaze sharpened, cold as winter ice. "Betray that trust, and we will return." Eli swallowed hard, tension coiling in his gut like a steel spring. He had survived war, ambush, and betrayal, but nothing compared to this. Standing in the middle of a valley surrounded by warriors, holding the life of a child in his hands. The drums fell silent, the snow around the cabin trembling under the hooves of warriors who now waited, poised like statues. Even the wind seemed to still, the trees holding their breath. Chayton crawled closer, clutching the falcon necklace, eyes fixed on Eli. "You saved me," the boy whispered. "Father, you saved me." Eli nodded once, hard and quiet, keeping his eyes on Iron Hawk. "I did what I had to. You'll live, because I kept my promise." For a moment, the world seemed frozen. Snow falling softly, the wind paused, warriors holding their breaths. And then, slowly, Iron Hawk dismounted and walked toward Eli, the child following close behind. The threat had escalated to its peak, but somehow, against impossible odds, the first fragile thread of peace had begun to form. Eli's heart thudded like a drum of war in his chest. The snow underfoot had turned to slush around the cabin as Iron Hawk approached, every step deliberate, his eyes glinting like black obsidian. Behind him, Crow Fong shifted uneasily, hands tight on his bow, muscles coiled and ready. The rest of the warriors spread across the valley like dark waves frozen mid-crash, their painted faces expressionless, weapons glinting in the late afternoon sun. Eli lowered his rifle slightly but kept it within reach. One wrong move, and it wouldn't matter if he had survived Platte Creek or countless skirmishes afterward. This cabin would be reduced to ash, and Chayton would vanish forever into the fury of war. Iron Hawk stopped a dozen feet from Eli, boots crunching the snow, and looked down at the boy. Chayton flinched but held his ground, tiny hands clutching the falcon necklace. The chief's gaze softened just slightly as it rested on the boy. "You gave life to my blood," Iron Hawk said slowly, voice deep and resonant, carrying across the valley. "From this day, you are under my protection." Eli swallowed, muscles taut, trying to read the unspoken words beneath the promise. Protection was rare, it was binding, yes, but fragile. A single betrayal could undo it all. Iron Hawk's eyes snapped to Crow Fong, who was tightening his jaw, hands itching to strike. "You, child," the chief said, pointing at Chayton. "Speak. Tell them what this man has done for you." Chayton's small body trembled, but he straightened. His voice, weak yet firm, rose over the frozen valley. "Last night," he said in his native tongue, "this man fed me. He warmed me. He protected me. I am alive because of him." The warriors froze. Bows twitched, but no arrow was released. Muskets lowered. The valley, tense and waiting, seemed to inhale. Crow Fong's lips parted in anger. "He lies. He kidnapped you. Hid you from your father." Chayton shook his head, eyes wide. "No. He saved me. He kept me alive." Iron Hawk's gaze pierced Crow Fong, steady and lethal. "You see the truth, boy. Speak it, or step aside." Crow Fong's scowl deepened, but he did not move. He could not. Iron Hawk's authority was absolute. Even he, reckless and ambitious, knew the weight of defying a war chief like Iron Hawk, especially when the life of the chief's son hung in the balance. Eli exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle fully now. The boy's courage had bought them a precious moment, and maybe, just maybe, more. Iron Hawk stepped closer to Eli, eyes never leaving his face. The chief's hand reached out and rested firmly on Eli's shoulder, strong and unyielding. "From this day, your life is mine to guard," Iron Hawk said. "But remember, betrayal of this trust brings a swift reckoning." Eli nodded, swallowing the lump of tension lodged in his throat. He had never wanted honor or allegiance. All he had wanted was to stay alive and keep the boy safe. And yet, here he was, bound by an unspoken vow to one of the most feared warriors in the West. The valley remained silent. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, landing on horses' backs, on helmets, on weapons. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see if the fragile thread of peace would hold. Then Iron Hawk bent slightly, speaking to the boy. "Come," he said. Chayton stepped forward slowly, placing himself between Eli and his father. He looked up at Eli, small but resolute. "You kept me safe," he whispered. "Thank you." Eli's throat tightened, and he bent to scoop the boy up in a gentle embrace. It was a fleeting moment, fatherly, protective, and silent, but it sealed the bond that had formed between them. Ironhawk's gaze swept over Eli one last time. "Let this be a lesson to all who consider defiance," the chief said. Then he mounted his horse and signaled the warriors to regroup. One by one, they melted back into the valley, their disciplined movements as silent and precise as shadows falling at dusk. Crow Fong lingered, glaring, but the chief's presence kept him rooted. Finally, with a frustrated snarl, he remounted, retreating into the growing dusk. Eli set the boy down gently, brushing snow from his coat. "You all right, kid?" he asked, voice hoarse. Chayton nodded, eyes wide but shining with newfound strength. "Yes," he said softly, "because of you." Eli felt a rare smile tug at his lips. He had faced death before on battlefields where hope had been a stranger. But today, in the frozen valley of Wyoming, he had saved a life and earned a trust stronger than any army, deeper than any oath. As night fell, Ironhawk and Chayton rode back into the forest together, father and son reunited. Eli stood on the porch of his cabin, rifle laid across the rail, heart still pounding, but lighter somehow. For a week, the valley remained still. The drums of war faded, replaced by the subtle whispers of wind through pine and snow. The boy visited occasionally, leaving small gifts, dried meat, carved talismans, tokens of gratitude. And though peace had returned to the land, Eli knew it was fragile. He had seen too much, lost too much, to believe it would last forever. But in the quiet, with the snow settling around his cabin, Eli Mercer felt something he hadn't in years. The weight of a life lived for someone else, and the knowledge that sometimes courage was not in the gun or the blade. It was in the choice to act when the world told you to turn away. Tonight he would sleep, and tomorrow he would be ready for whatever came next. The valley was quiet again. The snow, freshly fallen during the night, blanketed the hills and trees in a soft, unbroken white. Even the creek had slowed, its waters moving beneath a thin layer of ice that sparkled like fractured crystal in the early morning sun. Eli Mercer stepped out of his cabin, boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. The air smelled of pine, cold, clean, and unforgiving. He breathed it in slowly, letting it fill the hollow space that had grown in his chest during years of solitude. For the first time in a long while, there was no immediate threat, no drums pounding across the valley, no shadows circling with malice. He glanced toward the ridge where the Sioux had gathered days ago. Nothing moved. No sign of riders, no hoofprints in the snow beyond those already erased by the wind. It was as if the valley itself had exhaled, releasing the tension that had held it in a frozen grip for nearly a week. Inside, the cabin felt warmer somehow, more alive. The fire had burned low overnight, but the embers glowed faintly, casting flickering light across the walls. Chayton's blanket, neatly folded on the cot, seemed untouched, a small testament to the boy's brief but profound impact on this space. Eli sat down heavily at the table, resting his elbows on the rough wood, and stared into the fire. His mind wandered back to Ironhawk's words, "Betray that trust, and we will return." They were not threats in the way bullets or arrows could be threats. They were warnings etched in the deep, unyielding stone of authority, a promise to hold him accountable. And Eli respected it. For days afterward, the rhythm of life in the valley returned to a quiet routine. He tended to his horses, repairing fences bent under the weight of winter storms. He chopped wood, stacked it neatly for the weeks to come, and repaired the sections of cabin wall that had been weakened by wind and ice. Every task was methodical, measured, and purposeful. It was a return to life in its most elemental form, a life that demanded nothing of him beyond his own effort. But something subtle had shifted. Eli no longer felt entirely alone. The memory of Chayton's small, determined voice lingered in the cabin, a reminder that even in the vast wilderness, lives could intersect and leave indelible marks. Some nights, when the wind moved in from the western ridge, carrying the faint echo of distant pines, Eli swore he could still hear the beat of drums, low and distant. Not threatening, not angry. Simply alive, a heartbeat from another world that had touched his own. It reminded him that the world beyond the ridge was vast, complex, and filled with people who had their own codes, their own loyalties, their own power. One morning, as Eli repaired a section of the fence near the creek, he noticed a small bundle resting on his porch. He approached cautiously, hand hovering near his rifle, but there was no danger here, only gifts. A few pieces of dried meat, neatly wrapped in cloth. A small carved talisman shaped like a falcon, smooth and polished from careful hands. Chayton had left them. The boy was alive, well, and grateful. Eli picked up the talisman and ran his fingers over the carving. He felt a connection, fragile yet undeniable, to something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Belonging. Not to the world of soldiers or the chaos of the frontier, but to a place where life and courage intersected in the most unexpected ways. Even so, he remained vigilant. Trust, he knew, was a fragile commodity. One misstep, one betrayal, and the fragile piece could shatter. But for now, the valley lay silent, and that was enough. The days lengthened slowly as winter began to recede, and Eli moved through his routines with a quiet determination. He repaired tools, tended the animals, and kept the cabin orderly. Each small act was a meditation, a recognition that survival was more than staying alive. It was honoring the lives he touched, the promises he made, and the choices he upheld. Chayton continued his visits, each one brief but meaningful. Sometimes the boy would sit on the porch, carefully carving small figures from wood or stone, leaving them for Eli as tokens. Other times, he would share a piece of food, a story, or a word in his native tongue that Eli could barely pronounce but cherished nonetheless. These interactions were quiet, understated, yet they carried the weight of profound gratitude and trust. Eli found himself speaking to the boy in return, sharing small lessons of survival, the names of the stars overhead, the ways of the land. In these exchanges, a bond grew, one of mutual respect, unspoken understanding, and a sense that life, despite its hardships, could still be tender and human. He thought about Platte Creek often, but those memories no longer had the same oppressive weight. The ghosts of the past remained, yes, but they were tempered by the present, by a boy's life saved, by a promise honored, and by the knowledge that even in a world as harsh as the Wyoming wilderness, choices could define a man more than battles ever could. The sun dipped low on the horizon one evening, casting long shadows across the valley. Eli stood on the porch, looking out over the snow-blanketed hills, feeling the crisp air in his lungs. In the distance, he thought he saw movement, not threatening, just familiar. Chayton, perhaps, returning from a brief errand, or the wind playing tricks on tired eyes. Eli smiled faintly. Life had returned to its quiet rhythm. There would be other challenges, other threats, other echoes of the past. But for now, the world was peaceful. The snow fell softly as night approached, the valley blanketed once more in white. Eli returned inside the cabin, stoking the fire, listening to the gentle crackle of the flames. The boy's talisman rested on the table, a small, constant reminder of courage, trust, and the fragile beauty of life preserved. And in the silence, Eli Mercer understood something he had not felt in a long time. That even in a world filled with danger and loss, moments of quiet, unguarded peace were worth everything. He settled by the fire, rifle resting within reach, heart calm but alert, and allowed himself to breathe. For the first time in years, he felt a measure of safety, not guaranteed, not permanent, but real. And as the night deepened, with snow swirling outside the cabin and the valley holding its breath, Eli knew that some bonds, once formed, could not be broken. The world had returned to its quiet, fragile rhythm. But Eli Mercer would never forget that, on a cold Wyoming night, a small boy had appeared at his door, and with one act of courage and mercy, had changed the course of both their lives forever.